DK. Welcome to the Wheel Print Podcast, brought to you by APM Medical Supplies. This podcast is created to uncover the inside game of adaptive athletes, their untold stories of what drives them and makes them tick. So be prepared to be inspired as we discover the trials and triumphs of the human spirit. Enjoy this show. Hey, I'm DK. I'm the host of the Wheel Print Podcast. Today's guest is a great friend of mine. He's the CEO of the National Wheelchair Basketball Association. He's a two-time Paralympic bronze medalist, a two-time world champion, and he's a two-timer, in other words, two-time intercollegiate champion, a D1 Division I champion with the Milwaukee Bucks. And I believe he's a D3 national champion with the Cleveland team. Is that correct, Will?
You nailed it, Dave. Thank you. It's a very generous introduction, and I think it implies that I've been around for a fairly long time. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, and quite a wheel print that you've had so far, and you're really just beginning in my book. Will, we'd really like to get to know you through this podcast in greater depth, greater detail. We know kind of the icing on the cake related to what you've done athletically, but we'll cover that, but we'll also cover just some of the inside game of Will Waller. And why don't you start with your rather unique way of entering this world of being a wheelhead?
Yeah, well, I think it's not unique to people who grew up in an inner city. So when you think across the country and the different ways that people find themselves using a wheelchair, most folks from the inner city are familiar with people who've suffered a gunshot wound. And in a lot of cases, people who get shot, they end up with a spinal cord injury. And that's my story. But prior to the shooting, I was a kid who grew up in a blue collar family in a really tough part of Chicago, where gangs and drugs were really prevalent. And unfortunately, in that environment, education wasn't as valued as it is maybe in a more affluent area, where it's just an expectation that you're going to go to college and you're going to get a college degree. So in my case, when I barely finished high school, I thought that I was farther along than so many other people because many of them didn't have a high school diploma and I did. But what happened next was really just a function of the fact that I didn't really have a plan coming out of school. And so shortly after that, I ended up joining the gang in my neighborhood and doing what a lot of them do, whether that be, partying, selling drugs, and doing a variety of other things. I ended up kind of immersing myself in that lifestyle. And it really was just about a year after that, on May 23rd, 92, that I ended up getting shot by a rival gang. And a pretty sort of dramatic way of finding my way to the hospital and being lucky enough to make it there where they could kind of intervene and make sure that they stabilized me and whatnot. But nearly 30 years ago was the night that I was shot as, a former gangbanger and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. And that kind of set me down a completely different path. And unfortunately, I had a 2-year period after my disability where I went into a very dark depression and was embarrassed by two things, Dave. I was embarrassed by the fact that I was in a wheelchair because most people growing up where I did, they didn't really know how to interact with the wheelchair. So my perception was 100% negative about the wheelchair. It was more about what I couldn't do versus what I might be able to do. And then the other thing I was embarrassed by was the fact that I had put myself in that situation. Although I was doing dumb things, I was smart enough to know that nobody else was to blame for what happened to me. It was all of the choices that I made that put me into that situation. And so that led me to go into a very dark place where I kind of hid away for 1 year. And I ended up being what they call stuck in extension. And what stuck in extension means is you can't bend. You're like fully stuck in extension. So I felt so bad for myself that I was laying around literally for months at a time, where I could no longer sit up in my wheelchair. And I had to go back to rehab a second time, where the physical therapist literally had to break the adhesions at my knees and my hips and my lower back in order to get me into a position where I could sit up again. And so after I went through that very painful process, I told myself when I got out of rehab that I was no longer going to feel sorry for myself. So again, I ended up going out and masking my pain in other ways, drinking prescription drugs, street drugs, and all of that to try to cope with the pain. And unfortunately went down the same path that led to my wheelchair, making poor decisions, with drugs and people I was hanging out with again. And it wasn't until I had a run-in with the law and almost went away to prison that I finally had a doctor really call me to task and challenge me to kind of do something with my high school diploma.
Wow, man. Yeah, so I use the word unique in that intro, but it's all a frame of reference because I came from a city where crime and color didn't really exist. I lived a pretty protected lifestyle. Now I could find the underbelly of any kind of deviant behavior I wanted, but just the same. But Will, I'm curious, man, because when I think of that moment, you knew you were shot. Were you still awake? And what was that moment? What was that like? I mean, what rushed through your head at that critical time?
Well, it's interesting. The immediate impact of the bullet, and I learned this later, but my legs felt like they were on fire. So I leaned over to the guy next to me in the car that we were in, and I said, "Man, my legs are burning." And automatically he said, "Well, you got shot in your legs." And this isn't going to sound very smart, but he starts chasing the car of the guys who shot us. And, they had the gun, we didn't, but we're still chasing them. So don't ask me to explain it. So anyway, they start speeding away and we're following them. It's the middle of the night and, blowing stop signs, blowing stoplights just to try to see who it is. And it wasn't until several city blocks, maybe about a mile later, that I told him, I said, "Man, I'm getting dizzy." And then he leaned over and looked over to the side at me, and that's when he saw the blood was coming out of my torso. So I didn't know until that moment that I was shot in my torso versus being shot in my body because of the way that the pain was working. But I was really faint at that moment, kind of slowly coming in and out of consciousness and whatnot. But the divine intervention, if you want to call it that, was that the route that they took when he was chasing them was leading us right towards the hospital. So when they turned off and he had looked over and saw that I was hitting my torso, he knew that he needed to take me to the hospital, which was just about a block away from that point. And I really don't remember, being pulled out of the car onto the gurney and taken in. I just remember waking up in the emergency room and hearing all of the noises and whatnot. And then you just go through the whole process. Like the detectives come in and who was after you? Did you see him? What was it? Blah, blah, blah. The nurses want my mother's phone number. And so it was just like a really frenetic environment where it's almost like everything you see in the movies and whatnot, or on the TV shows. And so my mom gets there and then the detectives come back in and they say that they found the car that we had described, which was a 4-door Chevy Caprice Classic, about a 78 or whatever. And they found that car. It was already burnt, but they'd identified it already as a stolen car. So, it was a premeditated thing these guys who came to do the shooting were going to do. And then shortly after that, the doctors come in and they say, well, you've been hit in your spinal cord and you're probably never going to walk again. And that's when, like things get really real, right? I don't know at that moment that I felt I was paralyzed or whatever, because I was kind of in a bit of a state of shock. But it was that moment there that probably began the process of putting me into a really deep and dark place.
Oh man, wow. I mean, wow. Divine intervention you used is an understatement. God doing for us what we could not do for ourselves, and as you related, you probably saved your life by chasing that car.
Correct.
So we're grateful for that, and for that divine intervention. Well, thanks for sharing that innermost details. So that was 92. I think I read up on you. You began playing ball or getting exposed to wheelchair ball in 94.
That's right. Yeah. So I had that 2-year period of time where I was doing those things and dealing with the emotional side of it. And at some point, I got involved at the Rehab Institute of Chicago, just going to like a strength and conditioning program. And there was a guy there named Greg Ridley, who you may have met at different camps. He was an Illinois guy, but he was an inner city Chicago guy, and a very similar background to mine as far as how he ended up in a chair. We probably grew up, he was older than me, but we probably grew up 4 or 5 miles away from each other in the city. And anyway, he was the coordinator of that strength and conditioning program. So all I wanted to do, go a couple days a week and, lift the measly amount of weights that I was lifting and try to begin to, get in shape and have something productive that I could do. And for a lot of them, it was like they were salivating. They saw this guy, 6'5", low level disability as far as the level on my cord where my injury was. And they were sweating me hardcore, like, come on out, try it. And I'm like, no, man, wheelchair in sports and wheelchair in basketball, they don't go together. I told you I had a negative perception of disability. So eventually they first talked me into trying wheelchair softball. And then all of the softball guys also played basketball, and they tried to get me to do it. And I don't know the exact date. I wish I knew the date off the top of my head, but I know it was a Wednesday night in the summer of 94 that one of the guys agreed to pick me up to go out to Addison, Illinois, where they have a special rec program. And I went out and played in this brutally terrible wheelchair with brakes on it, armrest on it, freaking push handles. I had a leg bag at the time, and I was wearing shorts, proudly displaying my my leg bag. And just to give you context of sort of the mentality, right, at the time. And but it didn't matter to me, man. I was pushing on that court, and it was the first time. And I know some people may not like this word, but it was the first time that I felt normal. Right? Because disability can be normal, but it was still new to me. And just talking trash, like while I'm shooting air balls, and I'm a bit of a trash talker, but just working up a sweat and kind of getting a little bit of that camaraderie, and so I was hooked instantly. Like a light bulb went off at that time, like right off the bat, that the sport could be really fun. I didn't yet know all of the impact that it could have, but slowly but surely, talking to a lot of the other guys, you began to learn exactly what the sport can do for you. Yeah,
amen, man. I can relate to a little bit of smack talking, because you and I have had our share on the court. What was always great about it is that we would crack ourselves up with our own kinds of comments, but all in the true spirit of friendship. But smack was part of it. But look,
you're an actual legend. But from day one, I've always been a legend in my own mind. So it didn't matter what everyone else thought.
Yeah, there you go. Well, tell me what Brad Hedrick thought about you and the role he played in your path and in your life?
Yeah, so after starting up with the RIC Hornets, trying it out on that Wednesday night, at the same time, I told you about the interaction with that doctor where she kind of challenged me on what I was doing, and she made me promise that I would look into junior college. So those two things were kind of happening in parallel, and so I was able to get some guys from my neighborhood to pay for my first semester of junior college after I checked it out. And then at the same time, I was beginning an actual season with the RIC Hornets, and couple days of practice a week. But I'm finally doing well in school because actually what my teachers told me when I was a kid my whole life, like, and my mom used to call me Billy. So when I went to school, they called me Billy, and they would say, Billy's such a smart kid. If he would only apply himself. I was like, yeah, whatever. But now that I'm in junior college and I want to be there, I'm actually applying myself and doing relatively well on my grades and whatnot. But in December of '94, the University of Illinois Fighting Illini team was there playing in a community tournament that the RIC Hornets host every year in December. And it was at that tournament, the college coaches, they still do it today when they go out to different events. They're kind of scouting who's who, and you're not just looking at the junior game, which at that time was just forming. You're looking a bit more at the open division to find talent to come in. And he pulled me aside, and he said he'd asked a couple people about me, and that it seemed like I was beginning to get my life on track, and that I was serious about doing it. And he told me he was interested in talking with me about the potential to get to Illinois. And so we went through a process after that of various phone calls and whatnot. And he convinced me to apply to University of Illinois. And then you mentioned earlier that I'm a two-time world champion, but it was at that time that I applied to Illinois that I actually got my first world record. You want to know what that world record is, Dave?
Yeah, you had me going there. What is it, though,
all right.
Will?
I'm going to let you know. So the world record was, he convinced me to apply to University of Illinois. And in world record time, they told me there's no effing way that they're going to let me into that institution. So we had to come up with kind of like a plan B, right? So I'm not going to get in right away, but he convinced me. And I think it was the best advice or some of the best advice that I've gotten on my journey with disability is, even if you can't get into Illinois, you need to transfer down to Parkland College in Champaign and get yourself out of that environment. Because everything that I told him about myself, which was as brutally honest as I'm sharing with you, is that I continued to kind of fall victim to the temptation of the surroundings that I was used to. And so I finished my season with the Hornets, and then I finished my second semester at Wright Junior College in Chicago. And on the day that I finished my finals, I took an Amtrak train down to Champaign, Illinois. And that's sort of like the visual for me kind of making that first big leap for myself. And he and, people down in Champaign helped me kind of coordinate my transition to that junior college. And that's when I began to get like the true exposure to what Illinois was all about and what competing at a college level was all about. So it was a monumental transition for me, sort of mentally, physically, and on every level.
Yeah, man, that's something else. I mean, education, I think, to say that it was really critical and important in your life, we know that you've got a master's in the streets of Chicago. Now we know that you're a graduate of University of Illinois, and we know that you spent maybe we don't know, but I do, that you spent 20 years in corporate world with some pretty extraordinary companies and organizations, Fortune 150 companies like Goodyear and Whirlpool and Honeywell. So you really made your education work for you, and I really believe it started in the streets, and you just chose that wasn't where you wanted to set up camp anymore, and so. Why don't you talk to us about that corporate side of you, Will, that was so much a part of your life for a while?
Yeah. Well, first, I mean, I think it has to be said, you asked about Brad. I just think it's so important to say that he was willing to take a bet on me to say, okay, my background was really tarnished, and it's not the typical Big Ten target student athlete, right? To kind of come from what I'm doing to, to take a risk on me, right? I could have fallen off on any step in the process. For him to put his name behind mine and say, hey, I support this guy. I think he's got something in him, maybe more than he knows he has in himself. I think there's so many stories like that that are out there in the world, but particularly in our world, someone has to invest in you and someone has to believe in you. And so for me, I'm just forever grateful for, Brad and what he did and all the people before him, right? Because there's a chain of people who came before Brad who were taking shots on people and investing in people to get to Brad. And then he made that investment in me. And we'll talk later about sort of, what drives me and what makes me tick. But back to sort of the corporate world, sport really became, a learning ground where you can learn how to be a leader. You can learn how to be a great communicator. You can learn how to be a great teammate. You can learn how to be organized. You can learn how to balance your priorities, right? So for me, I didn't have any idea how marketable I would be to the corporate world. Like, yeah, I have a Big Ten degree. Actually, I have two, but those degrees in and of themselves don't necessarily differentiate you. They do to an extent, but I think the combination for me was all of what I learned in sport and the fact that at Illinois I was given an opportunity to understand my potential and pursue it on the field of play, but then kind of pivot and translate that into what I was doing off the court. I was blown away at just how marketable I was perceived to be. And also I was so focused on never going backwards to that place that I was. I kind of became a little bit of a psycho on how hard I would work, so opportunity after opportunity presented itself. And because I was running away from my past and didn't want to repeat any of those things, I was willing to kind of do whatever it took in the right way in order to have an impact in a corporate sense. And in all of those organizations, you have to give them credit. They didn't necessarily see my wheelchair as a disadvantage. They didn't see my story as a disadvantage. They saw those things as parts of who I was. That coupled with what I learned on the court and at Illinois would make me a great asset. So in each of those places, they piled as much responsibility on me as I could possibly take. And I was fortunate enough to work with great people and deliver in each of those cases. But a really great foundation of what it means to be a business person. And so I'm really grateful for those experiences because I think they put me in a position to bring some of that skill set, to the NWBA.
Amen, man. I want to give a little context to Brad Hedrick, a Hall of Fame member, a collegiate renowned coach at the University of Illinois, and USA national team member. And we're grateful for the wheel print that Brad's left on our sport. But to hear this story of how he directed and inspired you, That means a lot. Will, you've been involved with or had been in high performance and on USA teams. And how long were you in that elite mode of trying to achieve athletic goals in basketball?
Yeah. So I want to say one more thing about Brad.
Okay.
So one of the things that really stuck with me when I was at Illinois, unfortunately, shortly after my arrival at Illinois, the same guy who had convinced me to start wheelchair basketball, Greg Ridley, who had been an Illinois guy, as I said, he ended up passing away, kind of in a way you would say, because he was unable to control his demons. Okay. And I remember very vividly, right after that happened, we were doing summer workouts at the intramural physical education building, and Brad was there. You know, he would hop in his chair sometimes and whatnot, and get fiery like a North Carolina guy would. And after the practice, we were talking about it, and I was really sad because this guy Greg also played a pretty big role, right? And Brad said, "Son, you either control your demons or your demons are going to control you." And it always was there in the forefront of my head. You know, I had my own sketchy background and made a lot of mistakes, and again grew up in a very similar background as Greg. And it was just great advice from a leader who I really valued, and it just kind of put into context that I've got to kind of keep those demons at bay. And he's right. And I still think about that phrase every day. So he taught me great X's and O's. He invested on me to get there, but it wasn't just getting me there. It was his example once I was there as well.
Yeah. Wow. I think of, Ed Owen, also a U of I grad, Hall of Famer. He was my Brad Hedrick, right? He's the one that took me under his wing and who I could credit with so much, along with so many other Vietnam vets of that time when I first got hurt. But, University of Illinois just is rich in history of impact that they've had with people like yourself and or me or Ed or so many others. So we're grateful for that. But again, back to elite performance and goals. Like, how long were you after that kind of thing?
Yeah. So firstly, I'd say because Brad was the coach in '96, he had a group of the athletes come to Champaign for sort of like a pseudo training camp. And a lot of the college athletes had an opportunity to play against them. And I was super competitive and still a trash talker. And it'd be true if I got in my chair today, I'd be a trash talker. But just great exposure to where the bar was. But a great way to kind of begin to set a goal that eventually I would like to get there. Right. So that was happening in the summer of '96. And then because I was helping all the track athletes train, I had an opportunity to go to the Atlanta games in '96 because of all of the stuff I was doing with them on the track, on a hand bike, just doing a bunch of training with them. And so Marty Morse, also a legend at Illinois, helped me get down to Atlanta to reward me for helping the team. And I went to the games, watched all of those games, and they came away with a bronze medal because Troy Sachs, a legend in the game, went off. And I remember in between one of the games or after one of the games, I would try to get down close where the team was, like a little fanboy, and telling Reggie Colton, who was a 3.0, just like my classification. I said, Reggie, I'm coming for you. I'm going to be on the next team. He was like, haha, yeah, whatever, young gun, whatever he said. And so, but it was clearly a goal for me at that time. So then in 1997, there was going to be an America's Cup, a zonal competition. And I tried out for that team. And that was the very first team I made. And Frank T. Burns, who I'm sure we're going to talk about in a little while, was an assistant on that team to Dan Burns. And he read my name off last. So I was the 12th guy picked. out of the 12-person roster who was eventually named for the team. So I started in 97, and we could talk about some of the highlights in there, but that went till 2002. And then after 2002, I had a little bit of negative feedback on the NWBA and the way some things were going. So I kind of stepped away from the game. I had already begun my career. And in 2004, I got married. So I basically, because of career and family and a couple of other health issues, stayed out until 2009. And then I went from 2009 and played on the 2012 team as well. Tried out for 16, got cut, and then ended up on the board.
I'd like to take a minute to tell you about a company that's important to me and my wheel print. APM Medical has chosen to sponsor the Wheel Print podcast and my DK3 events. This is who they are. They give back to our adaptive sports world. I encourage you to look at APM to provide you with your personal care supplies. It just makes sense to support those who support us. Email APM at info@apm-med.com. Mention the Wheel Print podcast to receive your next order, how you want it, and when you want it. APM Medical is a small company with a big heart. Now let's get back to our conversation with our guest. Let's talk about that decision. You know, you were on the board while you were still in the corporate world.
Yeah. And I'll give you another sort of vivid memory of Brad. So I went to the very first Illinois sports banquet, and, you know, all the different sports are represented there. And if anyone's ever seen Brad give a speech, you know, he's an orator. He's really good. And as he's given his speech, I'm kind of like creeping back in my chair because I feel like he's staring at me while he's like giving his speech. Of course he wasn't, but that's how I felt. And one of the things he said is, if you love the game, then, and you appreciate what it's done for you, then be sure to leave the sport better than you found it. And just like the other advice about controlling demons, that's always been something that's prominent in my mind throughout my journey and whatnot. And again, shortly after I was cut from the Rio team, I was called by Sarah Castle, who's going to be an inductee at this year's Hall of Fame banquet. And she asked me if I would consider joining the board. And after I grilled her, you know, with a bunch of questions and whatnot about where the organization was going, I agreed to kind of come onto the board. And yeah, I was, you know, a father of three and working in corporate America and trying to still climb the corporate ramp and whatnot. But, you know, it rang true what Brad was saying in my head. You know, like I've taken so much from the game. I attribute all of my personal success in my life to the sport and the organization. And I knew that it was time for me to give back.
Well, man. And now you find yourself the CEO of the organization. And, I just need to ask you, why'd you move from Honeywell, Whirlpool, Goodyear to the NWBA?
Yeah, well, it certainly wasn't my plan. That's for sure. You know, the rewards are different. The visibility is different. And so there's not as much personal benefit to being in the job. But I had already decided to leave the corporate setting because, you know, I'd had a really good run and I was pretty burnt out on some of the cost-cutting initiatives that they had me working on. And I was ready to pivot into some more entrepreneurial things for myself. And at the same time, the organization was seeing a significant decline in revenue and a significant increase in cost, which is inverted from what you want it to be. You want revenues to be far better than cost. So we started digging in at that time. That was the summer of 2018. And there was just a lot of negative buzz in the organization regarding some of the things that were happening with the prior leader. And so I started diving in and getting more hands-on involved. And a few months later, in October, we parted ways with the prior executive director. And we just had a bunch of things to clean up. And bunch of relationships to try to repair and all of that. And as I was doing it, I had a couple donors of the NWBA who were also advisors that I'd kind of brought on, who were strongly encouraging me, saying, "Hey, we think you're the guy for the job." And they said, "Are you enjoying it?" So yeah, I'm loving it, and so began the conversation with them. And then Sarah, who was the president at the time, and Tim, who's a friend of mine, as well as was a board member, they were beginning to encourage me to take the role too. So sometimes the plan is not what you have designed for yourself, but what might be designed through other means, right? And just kind of happened upon it and whatnot. So then in May of 2015, I went from an informal leadership role to officially kind of taking on the role as a full-time job.
Yeah, man. Well, and a lot has gone on, man. Since that time, we can only cover a little bit of it, but want to ask, just how you've had to adjust to the COVID years as an organization. That was and still is to a certain extent, but that altered everything for many of us.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what I'd say is even pre-COVID, we were in crisis mode because of all the things that we had to try to fix, So if you go back prior to 2019, the preceding 7 years, there was a $1.4 million loss in the financials of the organization. And then in 2019, we ended up for the first year being positive with revenues exceeding expenses by the tune of about 140K. So a big shift year over year and whatnot. So, and that took, I'm no hero. Certainly that took a great board and people who are willing to roll up their sleeves and do work to do that. And the board does it in a volunteer way. I was full time. It also takes a great work of someone like Brandon McBain, who works in the national office and doesn't get enough credit for the work that he does. But then you go from that crisis mode to then in the spring of 2020, COVID emerging. And it really hit the fan when we were at nationals. We had to pull the plug on junior nationals 24 hours before the event when everyone was expected to travel there. And then from that point, pretty much through the end of last year, and even to this day, to a degree, you're still kind of hit or miss on what the COVID requirements are. So, I work well under pressure. I think you get the benefit of being comfortable in pressure moments by being an athlete. But the last few years have been brutal as far as the stress on the organization. But I think it requires you to be as open, honest, and transparent with membership as possible, right? Like I know my frustrations in the past as a member oftentimes had to do with what I didn't know was happening. And a lot of times you can sort of calm the nerves and the frustration of individuals by communicating. And that doesn't mean that everything I'm communicating is in agreement with what everyone thinks. I think having a 3,000 member organization, you have to understand that you're never going to please everybody, and you have to do your best to communicate openly and honestly. And when you disagree, be willing to kind of take on some of those debates.
Yeah, well, I have a new appreciation for your passion and your energy that you give this job. Again, just with my new appointment with the Hall of Fame, you and I have spent a lot of time nearly on a daily basis. So I've seen how early and how late your days go in serving our membership. And yeah, you can't please everyone. The one thing I've learned in ball and in the NWBA is that we have a tendency to focus on when things aren't right, or we believe they're not right. And we put so much energy into what's perceived as being wrong, as opposed to celebrating successes, like turning the organization around financially. Do you have a long way to go still? Absolutely, but that takes a village of people to achieve, and a great leadership. So I want to say that, I'm one of your biggest fans. And I, I, I have to say too, I haven't always had a great relationship with the NWBA. It's been a roller coaster for me, but I've also learned that when I want to complain about something that I feel is not being done or is not right, that just means I got to get involved. I got to be part of the solution, and I can't just sit and be on that, negative side of things. And so I hope members can be inspired by getting involved and being solution driven, as opposed to just really focusing on what one believes they deserve, or that is not being addressed. So I'm proud of your leadership, brother. But so what would you say are your biggest successes outside of what you've already documented with that financial turnaround? What has been some of the other successes that we could focus on?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's a success that we survived the pandemic. There's a lot of organizations that didn't make it through, or that went bankrupt, or had any number of other issues as a result of the pandemic. We didn't have any major outbreaks within our membership at events that we were conducting, and surely we lost members, which is devastating. But when you think about it, sort of across the nation and whatnot, I'd say that surviving the pandemic for a really small organization with a small budget and a small team that relies heavily on volunteers, that's a big deal. I think a success from my perspective is continue to recruit the right people into the right roles, because what you need, the skills and capabilities that you need to survive through a pandemic, are not the same skills and abilities that you need to grow after a pandemic, right? And so recruiting people to the board who bring a mix of them bring great internal knowledge with other functional skills, and then we bring in some external people who are willing to roll up their sleeves and also bring skills to the table. So I think that's a big success, and I think from a other success perspective, we still did operate, right? One of our major goals throughout the course of the last 24 months was to be able to provide sporting opportunities for those people who were interested and those people who were able to compete. So we didn't shut the doors on competition either, right? So that's been a big win. And then there's certain partnerships that we didn't have prior to the pandemic that we have now. And Challenge Athletes Foundation is a remarkable influencer in the space of adaptive sports. And we were able to do some creative programming with them, but beginning to build a great top to top type of a relationship, so that we can figure out, okay, if their impact is X and our impact is Y, if we put those two things together, what is the multiplicative effect that we can have together collectively, trying to put on different opportunities throughout the country? So we don't have all the answers on what that's going to look like, but we've got the foundation of a trusting relationship that's going to help us do that.
Yeah, well, it's all about partnerships, and in this ever changing world, and how those partners, change. You're not guaranteed year to year, and that makes things difficult, and especially coming out of a pandemic. But now things that seem to be on a great track, and let's talk. Well, no, wait, you're going to talk about Brad Hedrick again, or what?
No, I could, but I'm not going to.
Yeah.
But I think the other success is, renewing during the COVID period with two really iconic brands. So you think about the fact that our relationship with Toyota and Nike, as an example, started pre-pandemic, but to still deliver enough value that they're willing to re-sign throughout those periods and re-sign in a way that's going to create more value for the organization is a big win as well. In addition to the various other critical and important partners who we have, and then I think let's not lose sight of the fact that we were the only country that went to Tokyo and came back with 2 medals in the sport of wheelchair basketball. So despite it all, despite all of the challenges that, every person in the process faced with the pandemic, our coaches and athletes were able to go to Tokyo and deliver remarkable results. So I think that that's worth noting as well.
I do too. And the fact that we could sit in our front rooms and watch it all happen was also another statement of success, that we watched our women come home with bronze and our men come home with gold, and the pride was enormous. So, as is my pride for the Hall of Fame, my brother. The predecessors, there's a lineage in the Hall of Fame that I'm familiar with. When Saul Welger led the Hall of Fame, I'm familiar with Marvin Lapicola when he led the Hall of Fame, and then the closest friend in the world that I had in Frank Burns led the Hall of Fame for nearly 2 decades, and unfortunately he passed right at the beginning of COVID. But we're gonna honor Frank at this year's induction ceremony in Wichita, and we're gonna induct 2 members from the 2022 class. We're going to present to the 2020 class that was carried over because of the events that did not occur. So Bill Green and Jeff Glassbrenner will be formally presented and already inducted, along with Sarah Castle and Paul Schulte. And then you put a candle on the cake with a Frank Burns tribute, and we're going to have quite an affair. And how do you feel about the Hall of Fame, Will? I mean, I know the answer to the question because you spent an inordinate amount of time of supporting me and this committee. That's been critical. So talk a little bit about the Hall of Fame. Blow it up, would you?
Yeah, well, I think like any Hall of Fame, ours is no different in the sense that it's putting a spotlight on the people who've had an excellent impact and contribution to the sport. There's a competitor category and there's a contributor category. And Bill Green, certainly a contributor. Frank Burns himself was a contributor. He's not being honored in that way, but he's also in the Hall of Fame. And then you have 3 phenomenal stories of players who've competed at the highest levels and have had sustained competitive excellence throughout their careers. Some of that happened in our domestic league. Some of that happened in our intercollegiate division, and some of that happened on the world stage and whatnot. And I think it goes to show, when you think about the Hall of Fame, it goes to show that the National Wheelchair Basketball Association from 1949 until 2022 has been an organization that is about producing excellence. And what I love about it, this isn't the reason why they're in the Hall of Fame, but what I love about it is the stories of what they've all done outside of wheelchair basketball as well. Like, these are all really high quality citizens, right? And they happen to be members or former members of the NWBA. So I'm really excited about the Hall of Fame, and honestly, the induction ceremony as you know very well, I think we've got some unique spins on it. And what I'm most excited about is that you don't have to be physically in attendance to be part of the celebration. The fact that we're having a live stream of production of it, and the fact that people across their living rooms or in their living rooms across the country are going to have an opportunity to see what this excellence is all about, and to feel like a part of a community. So I'm really excited about that. And there's other various cool things from a branding perspective and marketing perspective that are going on right now to try to drive engagement. And we've only been devising and executing this plan for 75 days roughly since you've come into the role and engaged the committee in the process. And so I'm really proud of the work that you all have done, and grateful for it as well.
Well, yeah, it's the board support, your support of this entire 12-person committee that has made it work to date. Now what's left is the ceremony itself. You can access that ceremony by tuning into the NWBA Hall of Fame page, and that ceremony will take place from 7 to 9, April 1st, and that's Central Time. But you can tune into that live stream, and we certainly hope you do. If you're planning on being in Wichita, please come to the event. Let's blow this out for our athletes that are celebrating this excellence, and really give them a crowd that they can roll away from and go, wow, man, that was the real deal. And that's what drives me is that we're able to deliver the amount of value and respect that the Hall of Fame should automatically always carry. And so it's going to be fun.
I think if we can shut down the Facebook server so that NWBA Hall of Fame page is on Facebook, we're trying to drive as much traffic there in advance of the event. If you want to go, you can learn a little bit about the people who are being inducted. Engage with us on that page, engage with us on that night. And we think you're going to be blown away by their stories. But we think you're also going to be blown away by the overall presentation for them. And who deserves it more to be honored in high fashion and with great recognition than the people who've put in the blood, sweat, and tears to deliver the results that they did. I'm really excited to honor this new generation of talent.
Yeah.
Really excited about what they've done, and we should all be grateful for how they've elevated the game. Because when our all-time greats elevate the game, it raises the bar for the next generation, but it also hopefully brings new people in. And that's ultimately what we're about, is getting new people into the game so that we can let the game change their lives just as much as it's ours.
Well, and there is the challenge, man. And that's why we're keeping our eye on the ball to engage. And so thank you, Will. Now we're getting to the end of the show here. And I wanted to just throw it out to see what your vision is for the future of the NWBA, and let it rip, brother. Because I know you've thought about it plenty.
Yeah, I think we have to do two really important things as an organization, and they might be in multiple parts on the how, but two really important things. We need to first continue to diversify our revenue streams and grow the amount of money that's coming in through each revenue stream. So a few revenue streams that you would consider are sponsorships and partnerships, grants, and individual donations. So what are we doing in each of those areas in order to grow those revenue streams? That's important for a variety of different reasons. We want to grow those revenue streams so that we can build our reserves, but so that we can also put together more programming. And honestly, one of the things that we have to do with those revenue streams is to try to build a little bit more of a staff that can implement the work. So a lot of times we talk among ourselves as a board in a national office. There's no shortage of amazing ideas. The real rub comes in and when you start to think about how you prioritize those ideas to deliver them with a limited staff that you have. And that's why programming is or revenue generation is so important, so that we can grow the staff in a responsible way and then go out and deliver the programming that we're talking about. The next part of the vision is figuring out how do we use our structure to put the tools and the processes in place so that we can go out and build awareness in local communities, and provide resources for teams to grow. How do we help a team or an individual who's interested in starting a team? How do we help them actually with the tools and resources to establish a team and make it sustainable? How do we help those individuals whose program's struggling with a little bit of an intervention to help them weather the storm so that you don't lose that team in that local community? And why is that so important? Because anytime you get somebody on the Wheel Print podcast, Dave, and you ask them their story, invariably they attribute a large part of their success on their journey to the fact that they found the sport or the sport found them, however you want to look at it. And there's so many people out there across the country who could benefit from the sport, but they may not have access to the sport locally. They may not have the belief that they can do it. But if nothing else, what the NWBA is about is creating access to sport for people with disabilities. That's the simple vision for the organization. And what we all need to do a better job of is figuring out how do we go from the board level to a divisional level to a conference level to a team level. And in each of those steps of the hierarchy that we have, how do we make sure that the tools are in place and the support's in place to expand our reach and pull more people into the game? Why? Because we know that playing wheelchair basketball increases quality of life. It's not because we want to give more people championships. It's not because we want them to go and get all the gold medals. Those are beautiful things, right? But I would give all of my gold medals back if I could make sure that every day I was bringing more people into the game. Like that's ultimately what we're here for.
Yeah, there you have it. And I think it's worth saying that yourself, Brandon, Tina, three paid staff running a 3,000 member organization. That's daunting. I can't even get my head around it. But again, it's all about who you attract in those volunteer roles. And Will, you're doing great work. And I'm here to tell you that I'm a fan of the NWBA, and especially for the support of the NWBA Hall of Fame. That was proof in the pudding to me.
Dave, as much as moving forward with this organization is going to continue to be a challenge to deliver those goals that I was talking about. One of the things that I often think about when faced with one of these challenges is if in 1949, Tim Nugent could convince a society of people who felt that people with disabilities should be tucked away and not put out in the public. And if he could work through that, and when his national tournament was having issues, if he could call the Rantoul Air Force Base and get them to give one of their military planes to go to California and pick up a team, then I think the issues that we face as an organization pale in comparison to what he was facing back then. So I'm not deterred, and I'm not concerned about going after and trying to achieve success on these priorities, because we've had so many people come before us who've worked on even bigger challenges than we're facing right now. So I feel great about it.
Yeah, man, and their wheel print is already there. So, what a way to end on a Tim Nugent analogy. And well, look, my brother, we've spent a little bit of time, and it's flown by. And you weren't short on words. You warned me on that, and but you elaborated perfectly to. I think have our listeners understand your role, your life, and what we can plan on in the future is great things. So, on behalf of the Wheel Print Podcast, Will Waller, I want to thank you for being our guest. It's been truly a great experience and episode. And so, for all you out there, do the next right thing and be a good human being. And tune in to Wichita and the national championships brought to you by Toyota. And thank you, Will Waller, for being our guest.
You're welcome.
I hope you enjoyed today's show on the Wheel Print Podcast. I invite you to check out our other episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or on our website at DaveKileyDK3.com. Special thanks to Dromos Agency for producing this podcast, our lead sponsor, APM Medical, for their support, and Performax Wheelchairs, a sweet ride.